On a dry Tuesday in March 2019, Della Mae Hutchins handed over a certified check for $5,000 and signed her name to a piece of land that nobody in Garfield County, Oklahoma wanted. The Cresswell brothers, Harlan and Boyd, shook her hand and walked away without looking back. Why would they? They just sold 200 acres of cracked, sun-bleached earth that hadn't produced a viable crop in 11 years. They'd sold it to a 61-year-old widow with a 10-year-old truck and a reputation for being, as the locals put it, too stubborn to know when to quit. The neighbors talked quietly. The feed store had theories. The county assessor had already valued the land at less than the title fees. Not a single person in the county thought Della Mae had made a sound decision. And somewhere beneath that parched alkaline ground, beneath the collapsed irrigation ditches and the cracked clay that swallowed seeds whole, sat an underground water reserve, so vast that independent hydrologists would eventually value it at $40 million. Nobody knew. Not the sellers. Not the banks. Not the neighbors. Nobody except, eventually, Della Mae. If stories of ordinary people seeing what others miss inspire you, subscribe and join us. We bring you real rural stories with real lessons behind them. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments. We love knowing how far these stories travel. Now, let's uncover exactly how a forgotten farm changed one woman's life forever. Della Mae Hutchins was not a romantic. She didn't speak about the land the way people do in films. She spoke about soil pH, subsoil moisture, root depth, and wind erosion. She had the hands of someone who had been farming since the age of 14 in Enid, Oklahoma, and the patience of a woman who had watched enough crops fail to never romanticize a single growing season. She was 61 when she signed that check. 5'4", with a habit of walking her fields before sunrise and keeping a journal that looked less like a diary and more like a field hydrology log. Rainfall measurements, moisture readings, notes on where puddles formed and how long they lasted before the earth swallowed them. She wasn't perfect. She could be difficult. She argued with county extension agents when she disagreed with their recommendations. She distrusted government crop insurance programs and didn't always ask for help when she needed it. Her daughter said she was the most independent person on earth and didn't always mean it kindly. But Della Mae understood land the way some people understand music, not through theory, but through years of listening to it. 3 years before she bought the Cresswell property, Della Mae had lost nearly everything she'd spent 3 decades building. Her husband, Roy Hutchins, died in the summer of 2016 from a heart attack he'd been postponing with stubbornness for the better part of a decade. He left behind a 400-acre wheat farm, a loyal border collie named Pepper, and a set of unpaid operating debts that Della Mae hadn't fully known about. Roy was proud. He hadn't wanted to worry her. By 2018, the bank had recovered 360 acres of the original property. She kept the 40-acre homestead parcel and a determination that surprised even her closest friends. She was not going to walk away from farming. This was not a thought she entertained. Roy's family had worked Garfield County soil for 3 generations, and she had married into that legacy willingly. She would not let it die because of numbers on a balance sheet. She needed more land, affordable land, to make the operation viable again, which is exactly how the Cresswell brothers found her. Harlan and Boyd Cresswell were not villains. They were simply men who had turned land into a spreadsheet so efficiently that they'd forgotten land could be anything else. They'd inherited 1,800 acres from their father in the mid-1990s and had spent 20 years systematically selling off parcels that weren't performing. They were skilled at identifying what a piece of ground could produce and equally practiced at discarding what they believed it couldn't. They measured land in yield per acre, assessed value, and drainage grades. They were never wrong, or so they believed. The 200-acre parcel on the eastern edge of their holdings had produced nothing for 11 years. The soil tested high in sodium carbonate. A previous tenant had abandoned it after 3 seasons of crop failure. The irrigation infrastructure had collapsed. Even the native grasses struggled. They priced it at $5,000, not out of generosity, but because that was, by their calculation, more than it was worth. When Della Mae expressed interest, Boyd reportedly told his brother, "Let her have it. At least someone will stop asking about us about it." They understood value by what they could see. That was their mistake. The land was, by every visible measure, exhausted. Its surface bore the signature of decades of sodium accumulation, what farmers call white alkali, a pale, crusty crust that signals ground so chemically imbalanced that rainfall beads and runs off, rather than penetrating. Where normal soil absorbs moisture, this surface repelled it. Where healthy clay holds water in its subsoil layers, this ground baked into an impermeable hardpan just 18 inches down. The old irrigation ditches were silted and cracked beyond use. The single pond had reduced to a muddy bowl ringed with salt stains. The fencing was rusted through. The entire eastern boundary smelled faintly of dry minerals on hot afternoons. Della Mae's neighbor, Curtis Fales, a man who had farmed the adjacent land for 40 years, told her plainly, the week after she signed, "Della, I don't know what you're thinking. That ground won't grow a cactus." She nodded politely. She thanked him. The next morning at 5 a.m., She walked the property alone with her journal and a hand probe she kept behind the seat of her truck. And that's when she noticed something that didn't belong. In the northeastern corner of the property, the lowest point, where the terrain dipped gently toward an ancient, unnamed creek bed, the ground behaved differently. Not dramatically, not in a way that would announce itself to a passing glance, but differently. The surface cracking that defined every other section of the property was absent in that corner. The soil there was subtly darker, and despite 2 months without meaningful rainfall, a thin seam of volunteer grass, the kind that requires consistent subsurface moisture, traced the length of the old creek channel like a green thread stitched into pale cloth. Delamay crouched and pressed her fingers into the soil. Then she pulled out her hand probe and pushed it 18 inches down into the earth. The probe came up moist, not from last month's rain, moist in the way soil behaves when something beneath it is feeding it continuously from below. She said nothing to anyone for 3 weeks. She walked that corner every morning before dawn and recorded every measurement. She began to form a question she wasn't yet ready to ask out loud. In April 2019, she called Dr. Raymond Good, a hydrologist from Oklahoma State University she'd met at an agricultural extension conference several years before. She read him her measurements over the phone. There was a long pause on the line. "Della," he said, "I think you need to let me come look at that." What Delamay had stumbled upon, and what Dr. Good would spend 6 months confirming, was an aquifer recharge zone. Aquifers are underground layers of permeable rock, sediment, or gravel that store and slowly release groundwater. They don't change the color of the sky above them. What they sometimes do, in low-lying areas where the geology is right, is push moisture upward through capillary action, keeping the soil above them quietly, persistently damp. The alkaline chemistry at the surface of the Cresswell land had actually concealed the aquifer's presence. The sodium-heavy topsoil was not simply the result of drought. It was the chemical signature of mineral-rich groundwater, rising slowly for decades, evaporating near the surface, and leaving its salt deposits behind. The white alkali that everyone had diagnosed as the problem was, in fact, evidence of the solution sitting underneath. The previous owners had seen cracked, saline ground and assumed the land was dead. They never once looked beneath it. By early 2020, Dr. Good's findings had been confirmed by 2 independent geological survey firms. The aquifer beneath Delamay's 200 acres connected to a significantly larger underground formation, one with the capacity to sustain major agricultural or municipal water supply for decades. In a region entering its 5th consecutive year of below-average rainfall, what lay beneath her land wasn't simply water. It was leverage. It was security. It was, by professional valuation, approximately $40 million in water rights. Word spread. It always does, in a county that size. Within 30 days, Delamay had received inquiries from 3 water development companies, 1 municipal utility authority, and, most notably, a law firm representing Harlan and Boyd Cresswell, who had suddenly developed an intense interest in the precise language of the 2019 sale agreement. Boyd suggested the aquifer likely extended beyond her property boundaries, implying shared claim. Harlan retained a geologist of his own. The county saw more surveyors in 2 months than it had in the previous decade. Delamay called her attorney, a water rights specialist in Oklahoma City named Joanna Pruitt, and said simply, "I need you to read me a contract." The contract was clean. The sale had been legal, final, and thoroughly documented. In Oklahoma, landowners hold statutory rights to the groundwater beneath their property. The Cresswells had nothing. Delamay did not move quickly. That was perhaps the most telling thing about everything that followed. She received offers. She consulted specialists. She took time that most people in her position would have felt too anxious to take. She eventually negotiated a long-term water access agreement with a regional agricultural water authority, a deal carefully structured to protect the aquifer's recharge rate, cap extraction at sustainable levels, and return revenue to her for the lifetime of the agreement. She used a portion of the early proceeds to begin restoring the surface farmland, treating the alkaline soil with agricultural gypsum to correct sodium levels, rebuilding the irrigation infrastructure in stages, and planting drought-tolerant cover crops to stabilize the ground above the aquifer and protect its integrity. By the fall of 2021, Green was returning to land that had not grown anything purposeful in over a decade. Curtis Fales came by one afternoon and stood at the field edge, watching the transformation in silence. Finally, he asked, "How did you know?" Delamay considered it for a moment. "I didn't," she said. "I just didn't decide it was worthless before I looked." There is a particular kind of arrogance that comes from knowing the price of everything. The Cresswells weren't cruel men. They were simply men who had trained themselves to measure land by what it produced on the surface and stopped asking what it might be holding underneath. Delamay had a different habit. She asked questions. She wrote things down. She stayed patient in front of problems that would have sent others away. The water was always there. It had been gathering beneath that cracked earth longer than anyone in Garfield County had been alive. It didn't need to be discovered to exist. It simply needed someone willing to kneel in the dirt and notice that something wasn't adding up. As Masanobu Fukuoka wrote, The ultimate goal of farming is not the growing of crops, but the cultivation and perfection of human beings. Della Mae didn't set out to find $40 million. She set out to find something worth farming, and in doing so, she discovered that those two things had been the same thing all along.